Perez once again described the possibility of peace with Palestine as a reasonable chance in as early as the next 3 years. As somebody who has lived in Israel for so long and who analyzes the political issues so closely, what is your sense? Is this realistic? I mean, do you expect to see a resolution to this conflict within your lifetime?
Well, I would even buy an offer to guarantee that my children will live to see this. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
In my nature, I'm an optimist, but I've been following the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians very closely in the last 30 years, and I was never so pessimistic and so depressed.
Well, I'm really sorry to have to end on that very sad note, I think, but
nothing will make me happier than if you call me a year from now and say, tell me how wrong I was.
I hope you will. Thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand this better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
When we come back, we are going to turn our focus to the crisis between Israel and Iran. Some in Israel, including Mr. Eldar, feel that the government is misleading the public and using the threat of Iran to divert attention from Palestine. We'll talk more about that when we come back right after this commercial break. Stay with us. You're watching Global Perspectives on MTV Sports.
And a top Israeli general went against the administration when he described Iran as rational, a claim that was quickly countered by Defense Minister Ehud Barak. The administration argues that Iran is still a very real threat because sanctions haven't worked since there is no indication that Iran has stopped its work on enriching uranium towards military goals. In a recent CNN interview, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave 3 conditions for Iran.
I think what they need to do are 3 things. One, they have to stop all enrichment. Second, to take the enriched...
All enrichment, even to 3% medical?
Yes, because they say they need it for what? Medical isotopes? So you can... The second point is, after you stop all enrichment, is remove the enriched material, and you'll get these rods from another country that can allow you to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. And third, dismantle the underground bunker at Qom. If they have no military goals, they should respond to this readily. What we want are factual results. We want to see the Iranian program rolled back.
Some experts say that it is unlikely Israel will consider a preemptive attack on Iran without the backing of the United States, but the US position also appears to be shifting. Earlier this month, US President Barack Obama issued a strong statement of support for Israel in dealing with Iran that experts said was supportive of Israel but discouraged preemptive violence.
He said very forthrightly the United States will not accept a nuclear-armed Iran. But there's another message here that the President is sending ahead of this meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that is that the early use of military force is not very smart and might maybe turn out to be very unwise force by Israel, because, you know, there's no military scenario that most people are aware of where all of Iran's nuclear facilities, can be taken out, and in fact, it might lead to a wider war.
However, in this past week, there have been indications that U.S. policy on Iran might be shifting. Senior government officials have stated that America might agree to let Iran enrich uranium up to 5% purity if Iran agrees to inspections. Iran has noted that it might be a possibility if other parties also agree to the terms. Unlike the Palestinian issue, the crisis between Israel and Iran doesn't appear to be one that President Obama can put off until re-election. Reporting for Global Perspectives, I'm Nadim Majid from the News First International Desk.
For our second interview tonight, we bring you a different perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian and Iranian crises. Parliamentarian Professor Rajiv Vijay Singh, who is also a presidential advisor, spoke to us earlier this week about Israeli insecurity and the realistic threat of Iran.
I was talking about Israel, and the region in general in the Middle East is so complex, and for the average layperson trying to understand what's happening, it sometimes goes beyond. Would you help us kind of understand the tensions in the Middle East and why does the situation with Israel and Iran mean so much to the region right now?
Yeah, well, I can only suggest you read what I wrote a year ago called Reflections on the Turmoils in the Middle East, which began with the situation in Libya 1 year ago. And I think historically you have this massive problem, which is the presence of Israel in what is the land of the Palestinians. Now, when I say that, Israelis immediately say, you're anti-Semitic or whatever. And I think one of the problems is that the Jews were just appallingly treated by the Europeans, culminating in Hitler, but not only Hitler, several European countries. And of course, the solution was to compensate them with land elsewhere. So they took this land from the Palestinians. In those days, Asiatics didn't matter, Muslims didn't matter. So these people were basically told to give their land to the Israelis. Now, I think that was bad enough, and if we had anything like the modern world, it would never have been allowed. But of course, as you know, the United Nations in 1948 was a European club with a bit of support from South America and so on, who didn't really understand Asia. There were hardly any Asian Muslim countries around. The few that were could be described as fanatics. And the result was you had this, but let us say we now accept that. But the boundaries of 1948 were completely traduced. Israel using the excuse of the other countries around refusing to recognize Israel to launch a preemptive strike. But who suffered? The Palestinians. And I was in Lebanon a couple of months ago. The sheer horror of 500,000 refugees who've been there for 60 years. The same is true all over the place. Gaza, which is a pit. So this monstrosity was allowed to go on, and no one has bothered about resettling those people. And you did have then the transformation of Israel into a tool, and it was a tool in those days, which is why I continued to feel sorry for Israel until its recent incarnation, of the Cold War and of imperialism. So you had the Suez War. You then had, in 1967, when Israel attacked again a preemptive strike, they took over the whole of what used to be the old British Mandate of Palestine, and no one has been able to make them move since. And sadly, whereas in those days we used to think of Israel as, in a sense, a little David fighting these large numbers, it was good propaganda, but it was still a small country. You now have a country which is equipped with nuclear weapons, has America supporting it absolutely, so that willingness to compromise, which marked the best of the Israelis, people like General Rabin, no longer exists. You have intransigence and total animosity to anyone they see as taking anything away from them.
Looking at it from an Israeli perspective, some of the historical evidence of their existence there and all of that, leaving that aside, but some of the struggles that Israelis now have is the constant fear of being surrounded by many nations that don't admit to the value of their existence. In fact, Iran, as we were talking about, very especially, called it the Zionist movement, and they want to see Israel wiped off the face of the earth. This sorts of statements is creating an insecurity within Israel. Do you see it's justified, though?
I don't think it is justified at all. As you'll realize if you talk to the peace movements in Israel, there is rhetoric. And certainly some of the Arab nations talked of not accepting the 1948 decision and wiping Israel off the face of the earth contributed to a sense of insecurity. But Israel, having defeated these people militarily, repeatedly, and then on the one occasion when they didn't, getting so much American support, you know that Israel is not going to be destroyed at all. It has far too many people in its favor. So there is a false effort to pretend you're neurotic. And the refusal to take one step at compromise, to yield up the settlements that they have been beginning from 87, shows a country with superb supreme confidence. But, of course, you play up the line of we are the victims. They're not the victims. That's rubbish. He could have argued that case in 1967. I'm not saying it was true, but it was more plausible then.
In the modern era of where terrorism or acts of violence have been pretty active in the region, and Israel being the victim in that case when it comes to those attacks. How is it going to look like now with Iran potentially possessing the power of nuclear weapons?
Well, what you've actually realized historically is countries that possess nuclear weapons are very mature about it. Israel has had nuclear weapons for years. Did anyone complain? They use it as a threat. Now, when you talk of terrorism, Israel is the one example of terrorism absolutely succeeding. because the British were terrorized by the Israeli gangs, the Stern gang. You know that the British governor was killed. British were terrified out of the place. The governor was killed in the King David Hotel. But to me, the saddest example of sectarian terrorism working is the killing of Rabin. The Prime Minister wanted peace. And to me, if you compare that with what happened with Egypt, which did accept Israel, Sadat accepted it, he was assassinated. But his successor carried on Sadat's path and continued peace. Rabin's successor just was terrified. And that's where terrorism works. Because what you call the moderate people in Israel just panicked after that. So I think the terrorism is really successful on the Israeli side. Of course, you get the terrorism of the Palestinians, and I think they realized they had to eschew that, which is why the PLO finally came to the negotiating table. But what happened? They were immediately repudiated. Arafat tries to negotiate. Anything he says is presented as intransigence. But when Israel refuses to change on the settlements and builds walls, so I think we really have a situation of double standard, and it's compounded by the fact that America now is the victim of its own preposterous electoral system. When you have a situation where extremists dominate the battle for the primaries, you can see that poor President Obama, who I think would like to do the recent thing, is terrified out of his wits. I find it so funny that people complain in Sri Lanka that government is not moving the direction I think it should move because they're frightened of electoral considerations. But, America is a standing example of a viciousness that extends to things like support for terrorism, provided people will support Israel.
Yeah, as you can see, I like how you explain the fact that it's far more complex than we may see it to be. And hopefully the situation will cease and there will be at least peace.
Well, the key is for America to tell Israel, develop democracy, tolerance and pluralism. Guard yourself and we will certainly protect you, but do not engage in murderous activity outside with other countries.
Now, with those words of advice, we would conclude this interview. Thank you for watching. You're watching Global Perspectives. We'll be right back. Sir, I want to thank you so much for being part of the show.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
What analysts appear to be saying is that the current stalemate between Israel and Palestine will likely continue, at least in the short term, because there is no one to disrupt the status quo, mainly the United States, which is the only country that realistically can. We probably won't see anything change, at least for another 6 months, until after the US presidential elections. As for Iran, it seems unlikely that Israel will preemptively attack without the backing of the United States, and it's even more unlikely that Obama would support such a move, particularly before his possible re-election in November. But the fear psychosis within Israel about an Iranian attack may be helping the Israeli government further its stronghold in the occupied territories. And that's our show for tonight. We hope you enjoyed it, and we would love to have your feedback. If you missed any parts of the show, the entire show is available at youtube.com/newsfirstsrilanka. We invite you to watch and leave your comments. This is Global Perspectives on MTV Sports. Thank you for joining us, and good night.